Warning: the following video contains descriptions of graphic imagery, gore, and sensitive topics related to death, cannibalism hoaxes, and the COVID-19 pandemic. This content is not suitable for all audiences. Viewer discretion is advised. Additionally, this video is in no way trying to glorify the violence or shock value depicted in the images discussed, but rather to document the phenomenon of the hysteria and analyze the origins of these viral mysteries for educational and historical purposes only. If you were on Facebook in the Philippines between 2020 and 2021, you probably remember the silence. It was a strange, heavy silence that hung over the streets, but online, it was a screaming match of panic, confusion, and fear. The world had stopped. We were locked in our homes, glued to our screens, desperate for an explanation for the chaos that had engulfed the planet. And in the middle of that uncertainty, a specific type of darkness began to bleed through the news feeds. It started with the bats. We all saw the videos, the wet markets, the exotic dishes, the blame game. Xenophobia was already on the rise, targeting anyone who looked Chinese. But then the algorithm took a sharp, jagged turn into the grotesque. Suddenly, the bats weren't enough. The narrative escalated from unusual diet to something straight out of a nightmare. Buried in the comments sections of family groups and neighborhood watch pages, a new rumor began to circulate. It wasn't just a virus, it was a curse. And the proof was a photo of a man eating a baby. This isn't a story about a crime scene in the traditional sense. This is a story about how art, stripped of its context, became a weapon of mass misinformation during one of the most vulnerable moments in modern history. To understand the hysteria, we have to go back to the beginning, back before the pandemic. Back before the memes and the paranoia, to a single man in a room in Shanghai, holding a camera and a prop that would eventually haunt the internet 20 years later. In the year 2000, the Chinese art world was undergoing a radical transformation. A controversial exhibition known as Fuck Off had launched in Shanghai, a showcase of avant-garde, underground art that rejected the polite norms of the establishment. It was gritty, political, and designed to shock. One of the artists involved was a man named 𝐤𝐤. But to really grasp the gravity of what happened next, we need to look closer at the man behind the shock. Who was 𝐤𝐤? For those who haven't researched into the darker corners of the Chinese avant-garde, his career is defined by two specific pieces of performance art that defined an era. The first was Eating People, created in the year 2000. It consists of a series of stark, disturbing photographs showing the artist apparently eating a human fetus. The second, completed in 2002, was a video titled Sacrifice. In this film, he documented the negotiation with a prostitute to bear his child, only to abort the fetus so he could use it as an artwork, specifically, feeding the aborted remains to a dog. Art does not get any more shocking than this. When you are confronted with images of this caliber, your brain shuts down. It's practically impossible to maintain any sense of objectivity. Your subjectivity takes over, and you feel a total, visceral detachment from the artist on a fundamental human level. It is unlikely 𝐤𝐤 planned this specific reaction, but it speaks volumes about his intentions at a deeper psychological level. This wasn't some quick stunt thrown together in an afternoon. This extreme work was the result of 4 years of slow, meticulous research. Starting in 1995, 𝐤𝐤 began contacting medical scientists, those who worked with human cadavers day in and day out. He was obsessed with mortality, one of the fundamental themes of art throughout the ages, but he didn't want to approach it with paint or clay. He wanted to approach it directly. Perhaps he took inspiration from the scientists he studied, carefully setting up a rigorous experiment and watching the results unfold. And the experiment he set up wasn't biological, it was social. It was a form of theater designed to pit his extreme work against a new, emerging society, the netizens. If you look closely at the photos, there are enough clues to suggest that the scene was staged. But the sense of immediacy his work created allowed for little objective analysis. As 𝐤𝐤 discovered, the human desire to feel moral indignation far outstrips an artist's desire to shock. His experiment bore results far more potent than expected. The hatred for him and his work spread well beyond the borders of China, even affecting government cultural policy. And yet, in direct contrast to the passionate, screaming reaction to his work, the process of making it was dispassionate, cold, and detached. Looking back at these works now with less involved eyes, it is apparent that both Eating People and Sacrifice were in fact staged. The fetuses used in both pieces were obviously inedible, formalin-soaked lab specimens. Knowing that 𝐤𝐤 didn't actually commit these acts, but only pretended to, makes a massive difference in how we understand his work. For example, we watch horror movies where actors pretend to torture and kill, and we are entertained because we know it's fake. If one day we found out the violence in a film was real, it would cease to be entertainment and become actual horror. 𝐤𝐤 relied on this gray area. Artists shock us because we believe, or take for granted, that they might actually do the things they claim. But when 𝐤𝐤 pretended to do horrific things like an actor, and then pretended that the actions were real, this double pretense brought him back into the realm of art by changing the rules of the game. He was neither an actor in a fictional scenario, nor an artist performing a real action. 𝐤𝐤's work lay somewhere in between. The whole action set up an experiment to explore the relationship between artist and audience, and by extension, the very nature of what it means to be an artist. It was this double pretense, this blurring of the line between reality and performance, that the internet completely missed when the photos leaked in 2020. The images found their way onto forums, shock sites, and chain emails. By the time the COVID-19 pandemic hit, these images were ancient history to internet veterans, but they were brand new fuel to a terrified populace. The narrative was simple. Here is why the virus started. In the Philippines, where Facebook is essentially the internet for millions, these photos found the perfect breeding ground. The panic was real. People were dying. Hospitals were full. And here, on a small glowing screen, was a face to blame. The caption usually read something like, "This is what they eat. This is where COVID comes from." Fact-checkers and researchers eventually traced the baby soup hysteria directly back to 𝐤𝐤's 2000 performance. In interviews, he has stated that the performance was faked. While the new context suggests these were likely formalin-soaked lab specimens, other reports have claimed they were constructed using a doll's head on a duck carcass. Regardless of the specific prop used, the result was the same. It was theater. But the horror didn't stop at the single photo of 𝐤𝐤. Once the door was opened, a floodgate of similar imagery rushed in. And this is where the story gets truly strange. Because while 𝐤𝐤's art has been documented, debunked, and explained, there is another image that lingers in the minds of many who survived that era of scrolling, a photo that doesn't have a clear Wikipedia page or a Snopes article. It is the memory of the blue table. I've spoken to dozens of people who recall seeing a specific image during those lockdown years. They describe it with the same vivid, nauseating detail. It wasn't just one baby. It was a line of them, infants, or what looked like infants, laid out on a cold, clinical blue table. They were arranged like meat in a butcher shop, lined up, displayed, some with missing limbs. The people in the background were Asian, walking past casually, as if this were just a Tuesday at the market. The lighting was harsh, the realism was terrifying. This was before the days of Midjourney. This was before AI could generate photorealistic gore with a click of a button. If you saw it, you believed it was a photo of something real. The psychological impact of seeing this while trapped in your home, fearing an invisible killer, cannot be overstated. It confirmed everyone's worst fears. The world had gone mad. Humanity was capable of anything. Unlike the 𝐤𝐤 piece, there is no famous art exhibit titled The Blue Table. No artist has come forward to claim it. And if it were a genuine crime scene, a massacre of infants in a butcher shop, it would have been the biggest news story of the century. It would have sparked international investigations. It didn't. So we are left with a void of truth, and in that void, our brains try to make sense of the impossible. Let's analyze the evidence. The theory that makes the most sense, given the timeline and the visual language of the image, is that of the hyperrealistic doll. In the late 2010s, just before the pandemic, there was a massive surge in the creation and sale of reborn dolls. Silicone or vinyl dolls created to look as lifelike as possible. They were used for art, for therapy, and sometimes for darker pranks. These dolls can look terrifyingly real in photographs, especially if the lighting is poor or the resolution is low. Consider the setting, a blue table. Blue is often used in medical contexts or in photography studios to create a high-contrast background. What if the image wasn't a crime scene in a third-world country, but a photo shoot for a doll manufacturer? Or perhaps it was merely a collection of medical teaching props being moved in a warehouse. When this image was ripped from its original context, some obscure website or forum, and dropped into a Facebook thread captioned, "They are eating babies," its meaning was erased and rewritten in an instant. Your brain no longer saw medical props. It saw victims. This is the dangerous power of digital hysteria. It takes the ambiguous and makes it monstrous. There is another possibility, one that hits closer to the geopolitical reality of the time. The user who originally brought this up mentioned Myanmar. During this same period, Myanmar was in the throes of a brutal civil war. Images of conflict were leaking out of the country, showing the horrific realities of violence against civilians. It's possible the blue table image was something else entirely, a photo of tragedy victims, mislabeled to fit a cannibalism narrative. A hospital morgue, a makeshift collection of bodies. If that is true, then the horror goes beyond the gore. It becomes an insult added to injury. These were victims of war, used as props in a conspiracy theory about Chinese eating habits. They were dehumanized twice, first by violence, then by lies. However, the specific detail of missing limbs and the butcher shop arrangement leans heavily toward the theory of staged props or art. Human bodies, even in tragedy, don't usually look like perfectly arranged cuts of meat in a street stall. The composition is too cinematic. It looks too much like a movie set. And that brings us back to the question, how did this stay on Facebook? The simple answer is that the moderation systems were broken. In 2020, Facebook was fighting an uphill battle against a tidal wave of content. Millions of uploads per minute. The algorithms were tuned for engagement, and unfortunately, nothing engages quite like shock and disgust. When an image is reported, it goes to a moderator. If the moderator doesn't recognize the image as a known piece of art from 20 years ago, and if it falls into a gray area of documentary or news, it might stay up. This allows the narrative to solidify, especially in private groups or in languages other than English, where context is harder for automated systems to parse. The platform became an echo chamber for the worst of human imagination. People who were scared shared things that scared them, thinking they were warning others. They didn't realize they were spreading a digital ghost story. What makes this mystery so compelling is that it represents a unique moment in time. We were collectively lonely, frightened, and online. We were vulnerable to suggestion. The blue table image is a perfect example of a shared hallucination. Thousands of people saw it, but no one knows exactly where it came from or what it really was. If you saw it, you probably still remember the feeling, a cold knot in your stomach, a loss of faith in humanity. But the truth, as boring as it often is likely that it was a trick. It was a doll or a prop or a piece of art, stripped of its caption and weaponized by a panicked world. 𝐤𝐤's art was meant to challenge us to think about what we consume. The irony is that 20 years later, the world consumed his art, but not in the way he intended. We consumed it as fear. We used it to feed our own prejudices. We are now years removed from the height of the pandemic. The hysteria has faded, replaced by new conspiracy theories and new panics. The blue table image has likely been scrubbed from most servers, lost to the archives of the internet, but the lesson remains. In a world where we can no longer trust our eyes, where AI can generate the impossible and context is the first casualty of the feed, we have to be careful. We have to ask ourselves, am I seeing the truth? Or am I just seeing what I'm afraid to see? The mystery of the Filipino baby eating hysteria isn't really about a photo. It's about us. It's about how easily we can be led to believe the absolute worst about each other, just because we saw a JPEG on a glowing screen in a dark room. Maybe the babies on the table were real, maybe they were not. But the hate and fear we allowed spreading in their wake, that was all too real. And that is the true horror of the story. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, stay skeptical, and always check your sources. See you in the next one. Until then, goodbye and good night.